Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiator, and here I am, hoist by my own petard, so to speak. Basically, when you start looking at medieval source material, you can draw certain conclusions about things from, the written sources and the artistic sources, the surviving archaeological artifacts, blah, blah, blah. And then you always find something. Once you've made your rules and you think you know how things are, you always find an exception. And yes, indeed, sometimes an exception proves a rule, but very often, in fact, probably more normally, an exception just goes to show that your previous conclusions were wrong. And this is one of the joys of archaeology and history, is that we're continually discovering or rediscovering new material. So what am I specifically talking about here? Well, a couple of weeks ago, I put a video up about the 5 worst weapons in Lord of the Rings, or the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And one of the examples I gave, which has always bugged me slightly, and the reason it's bugged me is because it's something that you see in other contexts as well. I'll mention that in a minute. And that is the use of a halberd, so a soldier, so it's a movie, or what, in this case it's a movie, and they have a halberd, which is a cut and thrust polearm that really needs the use of 2 hands, and a shield. So the other examples I was going to mention is sometimes you see this on like wargaming miniatures, like Warhammer, or you sometimes see it in, like the artwork for role-playing game books or fantasy art. And indeed you see it in other movies and other sorts of, perhaps even computer games as well. I'm pretty sure I've seen it at some point in a video game. So something that really bugs me, therefore, is when you see it, we know, you and I know, we know this, we know that a halberd is a 2-handed weapon, and to use a halberd, yes, you could kind of poke with it, but halberds are not light objects. They normally weigh about 4 or 5 pounds. Sometimes heavier than that, but all of the weight is at the far end. It's at the choppy, spiky end of a long pole. So if you try and use a halberd one-handed, you could use it like a very heavy and cumbersome and slow spear, but by and large, it is a weapon that requires the use of both your hands. So therefore, equipping a soldier who's supposed to be using a halberd also with a large shield seems idiotic, but that's where I'm hoist by my own petard, because there I am, looking through my own Pinterest page, which if you don't know about, go and give it, I'll put a link under here. And I was actually looking for something to do with hose. That's right, I was on the internet looking for hose, those being medieval trousers, basically, or pants, for those who don't know what hose are. But I've been researching hose quite a bit recently, and for basically in conjunction with my armour. So the reason you haven't seen my armour, by the way, is because there are certain aspects of what go under my armour that I'm trying to get right. So I'm getting a new arming doublet, and I'm also looking at the hose I've got. I'm probably going to get a new pair of hose. So anyway, I was researching hose on the internet, as I often do, on my own Pinterest page, and I was looking at some hose, and outsprung at me this picture of a guy indeed with hose, but also holding a halberd and a large shield, exactly like the Easterlings that I criticised so heavily in the Lord of the Rings movie. I think it was in the Two Towers. I think it was in the Two Towers, but I think you also see them maybe in Return of the King as well. So there we go. It's a perfect illustration of the fact that when you research something actually which is as obscure and relatively poorly documented and researched as medieval arms and armour, what I mean by that is we have, relatively speaking, to other periods of history and other aspects of history, we have relatively little source material to go on when we're looking at the weapons and equipment of the medieval period, in this case the 15th century. And sometimes you will find, in fact very easily, pretty much if you start researching at some point in the first few weeks or something, you will find something that will blow out of the water your idea about a given object. So there we go. That's all there is really to say. Just to remind you that when you're researching medieval arms and armour, or medieval history in general, there are a lot of unknowns, and what we do know is often only a snapshot and is a small letterbox view of the whole world. And there are lots of things missing, and of course the same is true of HEMA. When we look at HEMA treatises, that doesn't tell us very much about lots of other aspects of combat and fighting. It tells us about a little window view of what historical combat is actually about. We have to triangulate and use other ways of looking at the subject, archaeology, modern experience from combat and crime and stuff like this, and biology even, and all sorts of stuff, to get actually a fuller picture view of how certain things do work, don't work, should work, whatever. So there we go, the ongoing quest to find out new things that no one else has noticed before in medieval history, and it is ongoing. So hoes, medieval hoes, tell me all about your hoes. I'm always very interested to hear about hoes. And additionally, there we go, now proven that in the 15th century, at least one medieval artist, doesn't mean it was actually done, but at least one medieval artist thought that having a halberd with a large pavis was a legitimate thing. I'll finally end on this thought. Let's assume that that medieval artist had actually seen a soldier. They weren't just making it up. They weren't a monk in a monastery. They were an artist who had actually seen a real 15th century Italian or French or whatever soldier carrying a halberd and a pavis, or a large shield. Why might they do that? Well, I think one answer might be, there might be a parallel here with the housecarls that we see on the Bear Tapestry, who carry two-handed axes. There's one example of a guy with a shield on his back. And it could simply be that they are carrying these shields on the march when they're carrying their halberds on the march, so that they can deploy the shields, perhaps together with a sidearm, if that's what's required when they get to wherever they're going. Or they can put the pavis down and use their halberd. Or perhaps they advance with the pavises towards the enemy, who might be shooting crossbows or bows at them. And then perhaps at some point abandon the pavises or pass them back in the line and then go forward with the halberds. Who knows? Maybe they had some coordination. If we look at Machiavelli, for example, he talks about coordination between pikemen and shield and sword guys. Maybe they had some combination whereby they would share out the shields in a unit for some sort of defensive purpose. Maybe it's for a siege, where you wouldn't necessarily use the halberd, but you would use the shield. Who knows? There's lots of possible ideas. If you've got ideas of why you might give a halberdier a large shield like a pavis, and how they might use that pavis realistically, because this isn't a video game, you can't carry and wear endless weapons all around your body, then share your ideas below. And yeah, go and have a look at my Pinterest, and thanks for watching. See you again soon for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.